Samkele Maseko, a warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Tomorrow, we have that cabinet meeting, urgent cabinet meeting, first of its kind. What does it indicate?
It indicates that probably the government is looking at changing tact on how they are dealing with this COVID-19 outbreak, particularly in the country. The number has just jumped from 24 yesterday to 38 now. That's a 14 number increase to the number of infections in the country. For instance, the Minister of Transport, Sectoral Balula, says if drastic decisions need to be taken, they will definitely be taken in that special cabinet meeting or urgent cabinet meeting for the first time ever since the dawn of democracy in South Africa that such a meeting has ever been called by the executive and by President Cyril Ramaphosa. So it looks as if the government is looking at changing tact on how they are dealing with this COVID-19 outbreak. For instance, if you look at Minister Fikile Mbalula, he's in charge of the public transportation system in the country. He says that if this COVID-19 virus were to be contacted or have anyone within the working class, the marginalized and the downtrodden, particularly using trains or using taxis or buses having this virus, it will spread like fire to the downtrodden, and the country would basically find it very difficult to deal with this once it goes down to the working class and to the marginalized.
I can imagine that, the coronavirus outbreak has affected very many of the ministries, many of the departments. Have you heard some word from, apart from, you talk about the transport minister, have there been other ministers who've been very vocal about the fact that it's impacting them quite a bit? I can imagine that tourism, for example, has been impacted quite significantly by the coronavirus. What else are you hearing from the ministers that you go around interacting with?
At this point in time, not many ministers have spoken on this particular COVID-19 virus. They've basically centralized communication to the Minister and the Deputy Minister of Health, Joe Pahla, and Dr. Zwelini Mkhize on this particular communication of this matter. Fikile Mbalula himself today is saying that he does not want to speak much on this particular matter because it will look like the country is on autopilot and every minister is speaking willy-nilly on this particular issue. They will communicate and come together in this urgent cabinet meeting tomorrow. Every department that is affected by this COVID-19 virus, which is basically every department in the government, because this is a global issue now. It's been declared a pandemic by the United Nations Health Organization. So these are some of the issues that the cabinet will be deliberating upon. We do know that when it comes to water issues in the country, we do have a shortage of water. You go to areas such as Kwakwa, which have been protesting on the issues of water in the Free State. The Minister of Water and Sanitation, that would be Lindiwe Sisulu, would also be affected within this matter in the rollout of water provision in the country. Then you've got Minister Fikile Mbalula of Transport, if this virus goes to those who are heavily dependent on the public transportation system. Then you've got those who are largely affluent, who are able to afford to travel in and out of the country, go abroad, go to the European countries, which are the EU countries, which are the ones that are largely affected by this particular pandemic. Then the Minister of Tourism comes in. You've got various calls from parties such as the Economic Freedom Fighters to curb international travel in the country, to slim it down for this point in time, travel only when it's necessary. That's also the way the government is pushing.
That's actually where I want to go, Samkele. There was a sense by some of the South Africans, and you like me, we see a lot of what's going on social media, on Twitter and so forth. There was a lot of talk about the fact that there was a sense that government isn't necessarily seeing this as the crisis that other countries are seeing it as. I mean, there's been a complete shutdown, lockdown, if you want to call it that, in other countries. And there's been that sort of sense that it seems that our government isn't necessarily taking it seriously. Is that an indication that we have this urgent meeting, cabinet meeting tomorrow, that perhaps the government is indeed then changing tack? And will we then be hearing about other opposition parties and their sort of advice that they've given? For instance, as you mentioned, the EFF, they've been calling for a ban on travels from all coronavirus infected countries, for example. Maybe take us through what some of the other parties, apart from the ruling ANC, is saying at this point.
For instance, if you go to the Democratic Alliance through its Shadow Minister of Health, that would be Siviwe Gorobeth, they are saying that every person who comes into the country from the countries that are highly affected by this COVID-19 virus, European countries, they should be go through mandatory 14 days of self-quarantine. They should be self-isolated, quarantine themselves for 14 days, because basically at the entry points at the international airport at Ora Tambo and other airports in the country, it is not that good systems that we have in place to check if those who are coming into the country have the COVID-19 virus. So they are calling for 19 days or 14 days rather of self-quarantine for those who are coming into the country. On the other hand, we've got the Freedom Front Plus, which has said that unnecessary travel must be curbed. The minister must look at how they can look into curbing the travel of South Africans going in and out of the country. The EFF that I've spoken about has said that there must be a travel ban in the country for those who are South Africans currently in the country. They should not go in or go out of the country. So these are some of the various issues being raised by political formations. But what is rather interesting with the cabinet having an urgent meeting tomorrow, just one of the inland countries in South Africa, Lesotho, they've imposed some sort of sanctions on travel in order to curb the spreading of the COVID-19 virus. You go abroad, you go to Italy. Italy is practically on a lockdown, which the COVID-19 virus was spreading rapidly. Some South Africans who are on that list of 38 who are infected by this particular COVID-19 virus have been traveling to that particular country. For instance, the first incidents that took place and those who tested positive were coming from that particular country. So these are some of the issues that other countries have taken. But if South Africa were to take a drastic measure, there are economic consequences to this particular matter. Our country is literally in a recession. So if you were to lock the borders, nobody goes in, nobody goes out. What then happens? South Africa's biggest trading partners are China and the European Union. That would basically mean these are the two countries that are heavily affected by this particular virus. That would have a severe impact on our economy. So these are some of the matters that our president, who's largely economical, has to deal with within this particular cabinet meeting that's coming up. You've also had the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni himself, raising that the COVID-19 virus, the coronavirus, is going to be a game changer when it comes to the global economy, which could basically slip the global economy into a recession.
I mean, interestingly enough, you talk about Lesotho, but I want to just talk about the other countries. I mean, we are, it's very important that South Africa sort of interacts, I suppose, with other countries in SADC region in particular. Are you by any chance able to give us an indication of the kind of, I suppose, conversations, one would say, that, the various leaders are having in terms of how to curb the virus but continue with trade as we're used to?
For instance, if you look at President Cyril Ramaphosa as the current chair of the African Union at this point in time, South Africa's turn to chair, he had an AU meeting this particular week in one of the African countries. It's not largely clear what were some of the deliberations, but we do know that as the SABC, we usually send a team to report on these particular matters. This time around, that did not happen. There were many fears that our teams who would be traveling with the president could be exposed to this particular virus. One of our teams that was in Morocco recently, they've also been basically barred from this particular building and told to quarantine for the next 14 days. They're at home testing for the virus. Those results will come out. They're not allowed to interact with anybody within this particular building. So that tells you some of the veracity of the discussions that were happening at that particular AU meeting in one of the African countries. I'm just forgetting the country where President Cyril Ramaphosa was during the week for that particular one day where these discussions were being had. And 2 or 3 days later, he is now calling for an urgent cabinet meeting within the country where he leads the executive. It tells you that he's been engaging and interacting with other African heads of state on this particular matter, and it's going to have an impact on the African Free Trade Agreement that is currently there, because if you lock your borders, it basically means that free trade is not necessarily that free anymore because of the restrictions of the coronavirus. We've got to be extra careful of the goods going out and coming in or out of the country. For instance, our trade with China has heavily been impacted when it comes to the exchange of goods between the two countries, which will obviously affect our economy. That will be the same on the African continent, as they say. South Africa is the gateway to Africa. So with South Africa practically maybe taking a decision of a lockdown, it basically affects the entire continent and the African trade that will take place with the global community.
All right, Samkele, always a pleasure. Many thanks to you. Thank you for that, giving us that update. And no doubt we'll be hearing from you tomorrow, as I'm sure you'll be at that cabinet meeting or, of course, reporting for us there.
Just that one last point. Yeah. The Deputy Secretary General of the ANC made a very interesting hint, but never went into detail. We as the ANC are hoping the President will address the nation either this evening or tomorrow after the cabinet meeting. That should tell you the veracity of the particular matter. If the Deputy Secretary General is saying we are hoping to hear from the President, it basically means those discussions in the top 6 of the governing party are there.
All right, Samkele, always a pleasure. Thank you so very much for that.